Hello and welcome to the ICT Pulse podcast. I'm Michelle Marius, your host, and the editor and publisher of ICT Pulse, the online platform where we discuss ICT issues from a Caribbean perspective. Today we have Craig Nesty, the Executive Director of the National Telecommunications Regulatory Commission of the Commonwealth of Dominica, which is the telecoms regulator in Dominica in the Eastern Caribbean. Craig, welcome.
Well, thank you for having me, Marius, and good morning or good afternoon to all of your guests and listeners.
So, Craig, for those who are not familiar, can you give us a brief overview of the Dominica National Telecommunications Regulatory Commission, NTRC, how it got started and the scope of its functions?
Yeah, well, it got started by a treaty with 5 other Eastern Caribbean countries, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, Grenada, St. Kitts, and Dominica, basically forming an ECTEL regulatory authority, and came into effect sometime in 2001. The legislation was actually passed in 2000. So it's a statutory body. You tend to think of it as an independent regulatory commission. Some of its functions are basically to regulate the telecommunications sector in Dominica by implementing the policies, regulations, and objectives formulated at the ECTEL level. So the regulatory system in the OECS is a sort of a 2-tiered regulatory system. You have ECTEL, where the laws and the regulations and policies really get formulated, and then they sort of harmonize throughout the region, the 5 island states I spoke of earlier, and implemented in these jurisdictions by the different NTRCs of these islands. In terms of our main functions, well, we deal with all sort of regulatory matters, from dispute resolution to frequency monitoring and management to billing. I'm now looking at a quality of service issue that has really come to the fore since the Hurricane Maria hit Dominica, and the fixed broadband infrastructure being severely compromised. Most people are now resorting to mobile internet, and the issues around utilizing that service are now coming front and center to the regulatory body to deal with.
That has just set up a whole lot of questions in my mind. So we'll be going through them. So starting off, let's get you out off the bat first. So in being the executive director of NTRC Dominica, and I gather you've been in the position for about 10 years, what do you do?
What do I do? Well, it has been a really challenging job because my background is typically engineering, so I had to get familiar with a number of economic principles and legal and regulatory principles as well to effectively function. But my focus has primarily been towards engineering aspects of trying to improve the telecommunications space in Dominica. So the things that I'm personally proud of is being one of the second English-speaking Caribbean countries to implement an IXP in our jurisdiction. Our IXP is called DANIX. That was totally devastated after Hurricane Maria. We're just in the process of rebuilding that, and in talks with Google and Akamai content creators to host content at that location to bring internet closer to the public. So my day is really spread into a number of areas. I like to look at ways that we can help promote the adoption of broadband and bring internet to every person in the Commonwealth of Dominica. And in doing so, we've leveraged the Universal Service Fund and a number of projects to bring internet to rural markets that the telecommunications providers would not necessarily invest in. For example, in the Bells and Concord area, we had microwave links shoot internet up to the interior of the country so that we could provide internet at affordable rates to communities that were sort of overlooked as being viable markets for internet service. We also promoted content creation by implementing a lot of mobile app workshops and partnering with the World Bank to become a mobile hub. So that partnership involved the University of West Indies coordinating mobile development, entrepreneurship, and tech entrepreneurship throughout the region. And out of that, there was 6 hubs throughout the region, Dominica being one of them, Barbados, I think, if I remember, St. Kitts, Suriname, Jamaica, and I think it was Trinidad being the other. And basically, we had training sessions for young entrepreneurs. We had both technology training and business training. We had mentoring. We prepared them for pitches to different investors. And we flew them to different pitching activities around the Caribbean, in Jamaica, in Trinidad, and in St. Kitts. And out of that experience, there are a number of applications that were born in Dominica through that process. We have to do more. We need to get the internet to be more ubiquitous in the island and to try and promote a more digital economy, reduce the friction between commerce and so forth. So there's still a ways to go, but we're actively working in that direction. One of the things we did last year too was we applied for the Frida grant, which we won, and I guess we'll talk about that later as we progress through the interview. But we like to focus on the regulatory issues that ECTEL basically determines that we should deal with, plus other activities around promoting the internet and bringing broadband to everyone in Dominica.
So it does seem, and I mean, granted that the telecom sector in Dominica probably has been liberalized for a good 15, 16 years now. Do you find that the NTRC is doing a lot of regulatory work in terms of actively overseeing how the companies are operating in the industry, or has the NTRC's priorities and focus shifted since probably for all intents and purposes the markets have settled down?
Well, the focus has shifted towards promoting competition. So, for example, we had a new entrant in the market, well, 2 new entrants in the market, Green Dot, who basically applied, got their license, but did not roll out. And we have a local homebred telecommunications company called Epic, who is providing a Wi-Fi internet service. They've applied for a license, which was accepted, and we're now encouraging their rollout in the market and trying to assist them with all of the challenges and hurdles they face trying to compete with the giants in the market, put it that way. So we're still in the mode of trying to promote competition, albeit the market can probably only sustain so many players, because we had Orange, which is a French provider, in Dominica sometime in 2009. I think 2009 was when they exited the market. They were bought off by Digicel. And since then we had 2 players, and then we now have Epic, who is a more nimble, smaller operation who may be able to target the lower end markets, the lower end segments of the market in Dominica. Because since Hurricane Maria, we found out that both providers have decided to rebuild their infrastructure around fiber. And so they're advocating for a lot of fiber to the home and VDSL. And the price points to access that service is now coming in at about, I don't want to say something that's inaccurate, but it's coming in higher than $89, which was where the price point was prior to that. So that is much greater than 5% of the GDP, which is the recommended standard of the ITU. So there is a space there for someone else to come into the market and try to tap into people who can afford to pay about $50, $40, $45 for internet service, who may not necessarily need 20 megabits to the home and high-speed internet, but need internet access nonetheless at an affordable price.
So, granted that you've given us a sense of what's going on with respect to internet, but can you give us a sort of bigger picture, a broader picture of the state of telecoms and ICT development in Dominica? What about mobile and fixed line and cable?
Right. Well, it's hard to give you the state of development. I can tell you what's being proposed, because what you have to recognize is this time last year, the country was completely devastated. I mean, I've been reading some reports that said we only had 5 towers standing last year. So what the providers have done is they've started rebuilding their mobile network, and the west coast is where most of the activity is taking place. Like Roseau is the capital, and Roseau is on the west coast of the island. The second largest city is Portsmouth. It's on the west coast of the island. So from that side of the island, there's been a lot of focus, and there's been a lot of LTE deployment of mobile services in that area. On the east coast, we have a lot of problems. There's still a lot of areas where there's only 2G service or no service at all. So mobile is not completely restored. We're probably about 70-75%, but the idea is for them to move to a fully LTE deployed network. Both providers are focusing on that technology, trying to get the island into a 4G deployment. With regards to fixed services, the fixed infrastructure has been completely decimated. I mean, the poles, the wires, everything has been laid bare. So providers like Flow, whose fiber infrastructure is mainly buried, are in a lot better position. Surprisingly, I've requested information from them, which has not been forthcoming just yet. On mobile, they only told me their plans to get into 4G and how many sites were down versus how many sites were up. But in terms of internet and home entertainment, which is cable TV, they mainly have deployed on the west coast, closer to the Roseau area, which constitutes about 22,000 people in Dominica, Roseau and environments, with a population of about 70,000. It's really it's the most populous areas, and they're now moving further north on the west coast. They hope to get a lot done on the west coast and on a little bit on the northeast coast by the end of the year. There's a lot of areas on the east coast and southeast that won't have internet or fixed data this year, or maybe even past early next year. Digicel, the coverage is pretty similar to what's going on with Flow in terms of the restoration of the data network. And Digicel is also looking to bring fiber to the home. Digicel bought over a local company called SAT, which was a local cable television company. They've since rebranded that into an entity called DG Play. And out of that entity, they're providing overhead fiber. So they should roll out a little faster than Flow, which is completely buried infrastructure. And what they're planning to do also is roll out fiber to the home, a strictly fiber to the home network.
Okay. So let's just touch on Hurricane Maria, since I guess it is almost like the elephant in the room. We can't get away from it at this point in time, as much as I may have wanted to talk about it a little later. But all right, so we've spoken about the infrastructure for telecoms and what might be happening with respect to the recovery. But how is the island doing? And I recognize that from some of the reports, besides persons dying, I think about at least 30 people were reported dead, and their buildings were severely damaged. What about the supporting infrastructure? Because it's all well and good that you may have your telecoms coming back on stream, but if you don't have electricity, then some of these things won't work as well. And certainly if buildings are severely damaged, the priorities of your citizens and residents may probably be on, ensuring that they have adequate shelter, etc.
Absolutely. 90% of the buildings were affected. And the last report I looked at, I think it suggested that upwards of 30% of the buildings were completely destroyed. So that means there's a lot of people who are completely homeless. There's no building to go back to. And another 20-something% or so were severely destroyed. And then you have buildings who just lost their roof, right? And the aggregate of that was 90%. So the island has been really brought to its knees. And you asked about electricity. Domlec, which is our local electrical utility company, has announced a few months ago that I think they had coverage throughout the island. The issue they have, though, is for you to get connected to electricity, you have to be certified. And a lot of these homes, some of them still on the tarpaulin, so they can't be certified until they've redone their roofs. The telecom providers can't really bring service in there, fix service in there until you have electricity. So it's a slow road to recovery. I mean, the utilities are trying their best. Water company has done a fantastic job on the west coast. But there are still areas on the East Coast who don't have water continuously, and it's rationed. So it's a tale of two cities, really. The West Coast is coming along quite nicely. The East Coast has a lot of challenges still.
Okay. Just looking at the, I guess, a telecoms aspect as it relates to disasters and emergencies, whereby many countries, especially in the region, tend to have emergency communication networks in place to provide updates prior to, during, and after a storm or major incident. Based on the experience in Dominica, how effective was that network?
Well, that network was basically spearheaded by the amateur ham radio operators. And it might be useful to point out that one of the things the NTRC did was we hosted an event called Dominica, which promoted the adoption of ham radios and the revitalization of the amateur radio club. We've been very integral in trying to get the ham radio club reinvigorated. And I've spoken to the president a few days ago, and he said that I think they now have upwards of 20-something members. So they're now once again a truly active club. And Dominica brought ham radios using an application called Hamsphere to the high schools in Dominica to simulate ham radio transmission during a disaster. So it got a lot of young kids interested in ham radio operations. It got a lot of the security services and a lot of the maintenance services from different organizations. I remember Ross University brought in a whole team to that event to participate. We had ham radio competitions using that simulated network. And that was really fruitful because after Maria, all of the telecommunications infrastructure was down for 2 days. I saw people say 3 days, but the providers say they were down for 2 days, right?
Yes.
And during that time, the only communications available was a satellite phone and ham radio, right? So the emergency communication network really was centered around ham radio. I know the government has looked into adopting some satellite services and owning their own satellite services, because what happened was the ITU would have flown in equipment shortly thereafter, like satellite phones and broadband global access networks and VSATs to provide internet service and telephone service in areas that were really affected. And I think one of the things that the government wants to do now is have those facilities on site before the storm, as opposed to coming in a few days, a week after the event, so that they can coordinate the rescue efforts a little better. But I personally would advocate for a ham radio, family radio, emergency network architecture where you have different tiered ham radio operators throughout the island, even if it was at the schools, because most of the schools are used for shelters, right? So they could report in from these locations about their state, and you have family radios who could go out to a further radius within the community and gather that data, send them back to the ham radio operators who channel that back to the central coordinating center for the post-disaster management systems. I've asked if there's a national disaster plan, and sadly say it's not completed yet, so I can't really tell you what the strategy is moving forward. I know that there's been an operator called Neptune Mobile who's applied for a license to provide an emergency disaster communications network separate and apart from the telecommunications network for first responders after a disaster. I'm not so sure how effective that would be, considering that the telecoms networks are maintained 24/7 by the telecoms operator, and those suffered immense damage after the storm. And the fact that the power grid was completely shut off. The type of network Neptune Mobile would be providing would have to be rather resilient to withstand what we faced last year and be functional after a storm for the first responders.
Understood. Just going back to this whole issue of resiliency, because I understand that you're part of at least one regional task force that has been examining the resiliency of telecoms and ICT networks in the region. Can you give us some of your observations, or even the group's observations and findings, and have any recommendations been made?
Wow. Well, I'm not sure I'm a member of that task force. I mean, I have been contacted by Dr. Kim Malaloon
Okay.
to give her my insights into what I feel should be done, and I know she's part of our task force,
Okay.
right? So I think I just basically expressed to her what I felt was the way forward for Dominica and the focus of being on ham radios and we having autonomous systems which don't rely on the grid and which can be operated by people who aren't necessarily trained in telecommunications operations post disaster to get the word out. I think that was the thrust of my interventions with her.
Okay, so are there any other thoughts and that maybe you hope will be taken on board by other countries based on your observations and experience in Dominica?
Well, one of the things that we were struggling with after the disaster is trying to decide what the role of the regulator should be, because we recognize that we're not first responders, but we feel that there is a role because a lot of telecom providers after the storm they wanted a lot of frequencies because the fiber connectivity from tower to towers were now knocked out. They wanted to install microwave links between these sites so that they could get their mobile network up. The focus was on mobile network and microwave links. So coordinating of these microwave links became a necessary activity post disaster to get the mobile networks up and running quickly. The other thing is that we didn't focus on really is radio stations. Those are critical for relaying the information to the public after a disaster because most people have what we call the transistor radio that runs on a few batteries. And they're looking for information constantly as to when relief is coming, we actually really need to go for support and help and so forth. So the coverage associated with the radio stations is something that I think the NTRCs could help in determining and reporting on because to date I don't think there's been a comprehensive report on the loss and the impact of Hurricane Maria on the broadcast radio infrastructure in the island.
And let me ask a question because I think it's coming up increasingly in the discussions about emergency communication and resiliency. There has been, I think, even as it relates to emergency management, a greater reliance or increased reliance on mobile communication because everybody has a cell phone. I guess you can, send broadcasts, instant messages, etc., or text messages to the phones, or everyone is connected. But based on your experience and the fact that the mobile network, I guess, for all intents and purposes, was one of the first things to go during a major storm. What do you think about how it's being used within the context of disasters and emergency situations?
Well, I wouldn't say it's one of the first things to go because during the storm I was on my cell phone up until 9 or 10 o'clock. And I live in the southern part of the island, so I was probably one of the first sets of people who were hit by the storm. So the mobile network lasted probably not till the eye wall hit me, but for a long period before that. My brothers in Texas were giving me blow-by-blow commentary of where the storm was and what I should be expecting and so forth and so forth. But it did go down. It was severely compromised. I mean, the report said that there were only 5 masts standing after the hurricane went through. So I'm not seeing it as the most resilient solution moving forward. And some of the providers are now talking about building back these masts 2 times or 3 times as strong as they were prior to make them more resilient to the wind loading. But you still have the issue of the electrical supply to these facilities. And even with the situation of generators, you have the situation of guarding the fuel around these generators because we had situations where there were pilferage of fuel post the disaster. So I don't know. I keep coming back to ham radios because this level and the scale of the devastation is so enormous that it takes a while to bring everything back to any semblance of normalcy. And then you still have to fly in teams. You need to fly in a number of teams from different utility companies to come and assist with the whole restoration activity.
Understood. Okay. I think we have covered the storm as best as we can. Are there any final thoughts you might want to give on that aspect before we move on?
Not really. I think we've been pretty exhausted.
Okay. All right. So you had mentioned earlier that the Dominica NTRC is part of a wider regulatory machinery comprising 4 other NTRCs in Grenada, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and St. Lucia, plus the sub-regional body ECTEL, the Eastern Caribbean Telecommunications Authority. So what has been the experience of Dominica in respect of being part of such a grouping, and what might be some of the benefits or constraints, if you have any thoughts on that?
I think some of the benefits are that the legislation is harmonized throughout the region, so it gives the investor confidence knowing that he can come into the market and the rules are pretty similar between these 5 island states. So I think from that standpoint, it has been very valuable to these islands. Also, having the necessary skill sets in each NTRC may not be the most cost-effective way to run the regulatory system. I think ECTEL is quite a good model, having the legal staff in at ECTEL, the economic experts and engineering expertise at ECTEL, where the NTRCs can tap into that as needed, as opposed to having these resources on staff locally and having to pay for those resources routinely would be a lot more expensive. And you wouldn't necessarily need these resources on a day-to-day basis at each NTRC. So I think the model has saved us well, and I don't think it would work any other way.
So the whole issue of sovereignty, I think that for many countries, as much as they may like to be part of this sort of grouping, but there is a sense, though, within that sort of machinery that you have to cede a certain amount of control, or I guess a certain amount of authority to a third party, and the extent to which sometimes you do find, probably especially among the political directorate, that they can be quite resistant.
Yes, I totally understand what you're saying. And I actually think the ceding of some of that authority is a good thing, because it minimizes the impact of ministerial contamination in the process. If it was such that the minister had complete autonomy over all of the NTRCs in this jurisdiction, then there would be less control as to what could and couldn't be done. Right now, the way it works is the ministers have to meet at the Council of Ministers. So all the ministers meet and they derive the policy objectives for the regulatory framework at that Council of Ministers. And then that gets passed into law or regulations or directives at the ECTEL level, and then gets handed down to the NTRCs. So it sort of buffers the NTRC against subjective directions, and so it kind of keeps the regulatory framework a little more, how would I say?
I guess it's integrity.
Integrity, yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. And you had mentioned about the Frida Award and NTRC. Dominica won it, I believe it was last year, where Frida is the Regional Fund for Digital Innovation in Latin America and the Caribbean. So what was the NTRC submission, and what has happened to the project since winning the award?
Yeah, that has been a bane in my side since Maria. We won the award for a project, I can't remember what it was entitled, but it was around Internet of Things for weather monitoring stations at schools. And the idea was we would get the kids to build weather monitoring stations based on using the Raspberry Pi and some Arduino boards, maybe, and some sensors. A really cheap, well cost-effective design, but it would give them a sense of seeing just what is possible with the internet and put them in a mode of creating things. And what we're hoping is that each school would build these weather monitoring systems, and the data from these schools would get pulled and sent to one central repository where all the schools could log on and anyone could log in and see what the soil moisture content is at that area, the rainfall levels is at that area, and see historical graphs and so forth. And it would show whether or not the weather ecosystem varies continuously across the island and give more granularity to the weather reporting, although it may not be as accurate as the weather monitoring stations that the National Weather Forecast manages, but they only manage two, one at Kingsville Airport in the southwest and one in the northeast at Marigot. So it would provide a lot more information, and the students would then be very involved in that process. After Hurricane Maria, 90% of the schools will compromise. Those that wouldn't compromise will be used as shelters. Students were now out of school. The port facility was overwhelmed with supplies, so being able to order and procure things was just a mess. So we basically had to put that on the back burner, and we had a conversation with Frida, and on that conversation, they agreed to transform the project from what I mentioned earlier to moving into a community Wi-Fi project.
Okay.
And community Wi-Fi is one of the big things around the ITU and ISOC fraternities. And talking about ISOC, one of the things we did at the NTRC as well was start the ISOC chapter in Dominica to again promote the adoption and the development of the internet. So the focus now has moved towards trying to deploy a community Wi-Fi network. And we want to deploy a community Wi-Fi network that has a semblance of resiliency within it as well. So we're looking to integrate these access points with solar panels and being battery powered. So in the event that there's no power within the community, the individuals in the community can install these devices and have a local community communication infrastructure, which then can link to the internet through either microwave backhaul or long-range Wi-Fi or VSAT facility that may come in thereafter. So we've decided on the material list, and we've ordered the materials for that particular project. We've decided on the communities that we want to deploy this test community Wi-Fi networks in. And right now we're at the state where we're just waiting for the materials to arrive on island and for us to get local volunteers, particular people from the different communities, because we want ownership of the whole process to be community driven. So that's where we are with the Frida project. It has been transformed considerably. We also do have one pilot microcontroller kit with a Raspberry Pi just to try and get that working, so at least we can have proof of concept that it does work, and we can sort of then see how we can try and integrate that through the schools in the future.
Okay. So when would you hope that the community networks will be completed?
Up and functioning?
Yes.
Well, we hope they should be done before the end of the year.
Okay.
We hope they should be, and what we're hoping to do is actually target some of the communities on the East Coast who have absolutely no connectivity right now, and at least give them some sort of internet service.
Yes.
Because we also hope that we can use the Universal Service Fund, which is another facility that we manage, and put out a tender for backhaul links for that community, so that at least they'll have some sort of internet connectivity moving forward.
Understood. And I guess just probably my last question, since you mentioned the Universal Service Fund, and I gather though it has been quite useful in allowing, as you had said earlier, underserved communities to be better connected, and maybe underserved groups as well. So not necessarily just communities, but maybe whether it's the people with disabilities or...
Yes, our Universal Service Fund coordinator is actually very focused on bringing interventions to people who are differently able. So she has worked very closely with the disability associations, and she's introduced a number of access devices for the hearing impaired, people who are blind, speech impaired, and so forth. And she has taken a very keen interest in delivering solutions through the universal service to that particular sector in the society.
Actually, I'm not sure if you've seen it as yet. This morning, I publish an article on the Universal Service Fund, because there seems to be, at least based on the experience in Jamaica, the fund, I think, is not collecting or receiving as much revenues as it had in the past. And that is affecting the projects, I believe, that can be implemented. And of course, there are a number of reasons why that might be occurring. Rates are going down. We as the users are not using the services in the same way anymore. What has been Dominica's experience as it relates to the Universal Service Fund?
Well, I think it's reflective of what's going on in Jamaica, but not at the same rate. I don't think it is dropping as significantly, but it is dropping. The Universal Service Fund coordinator is not particularly concerned yet at the rate of which it's dropping. The other thing that I need to mention, though, is post the disaster, the revenues, the Universal Service Fund revenues are based on a percentage of the gross revenue of the telecoms operators.
Yes.
And what we thought would have happened post disaster, since the infrastructure was completely damaged and so forth, was that there would be a significant drop in revenue. We actually saw the converse of that. Revenues actually peaked post that disaster and has increased significantly. We think most of that is attributed to mobile data.
Right.
Because mobile data is very expensive in Dominica. If you have a prepaid plan, the out of plan rate, so you can buy data in bundles. The out of plan rate is charged at about $1 a megabyte. Now, if you have a postpaid plan, you can get 1 megabyte for 2 cents. So there's a really large disparity between prepaid and postpaid for mobile data. And 90% of our market is
prepaid.
And with all of the fixed internet down and no other means of accessing the internet, well, the revenues for the providers have skyrocketed. So the impact of Universal Service Fund dropping for this year, we don't see that happening.
Okay.
It might stabilize when things get back to some sort of normalcy.
Understood.
But having said that, though, there is a problem. I mean, the impact on the welfare of consumers for consuming data at such exorbitant rates, considering that the quality of service around that mobile data service is so terrible, it's a double-edged sword, and we're actually working actively to bring some sort of resolution to that matter. And there's some measures that we're proposing to Excel. One of them being allowing the data service to roll over from month to month. And our prepaid consumers, when their subscribe or their allotted data runs out, then they get charged this $1 per meg. And this charge runs for an arbitrary period beyond their plan. So it doesn't cut off automatically when their allotment is consumed. Right? So they now move from being a prepaid customer to being a postpaid customer, incurring a billing effect. And next time they top up their mobile phone, it's deducted based on their usage out of plan at $1 a meg.
Wow.
And I think that that's unfair.
So what was one suggesting? That basically once they have depleted the funds that they topped up to, that the service should cut off?
Yes, the mobile data service should stop.
Okay.
They should not be then allowed to incur charges beyond that at exorbitant rates. That should not happen at all.
Right. Yeah, I guess it almost defeats the purpose of having a prepaid plan.
Absolutely, it does. It does. But and everything is stacked so adversely against the prepaid customer in our market, because, like I said, they get charged $1 a meg, where a postpaid can actually get it at 2 cents a meg. So that's a serious disparity in price, but the same service, you know.
Yeah.
And our prepaid customers are different from a prepaid customer, say, in the United States. They actually have their phone for a much longer period of time. It's not a disposable device. The idea to them of having a bill is something they're averse to, but the loyalty to the provider and holding on to that device for years is something that moves them away from a typical person who buys a burner for $2, $3, for 2-3 days and moves on. You know what I mean?
Yes.
So the terms and conditions under which they operate, to me, are not reflective of the loyalty they have to the provider and the commitment they have to the provider for the service.
Okay. Okay, Craig, I think I've taken up a lot of your time so far. And I know that you're quite busy. So I just want to say thanks for having us and for discussing, the state of telecommunications in Dominica. I think we were all just devastated with Dominica when we saw the destruction that was experienced by Hurricane Maria. And I do wish the NTRC the best in terms of the work that it needs to do and the country at large as it continues with the rebuilding and restoration efforts.
Well, thank you, Michelle, for having me and for giving us the opportunity to share some of our experience with you and with your listeners. And hopefully the next time we talk will be about much brighter and better things.
Absolutely. Thanks again. That's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening to the ICT Pulse podcast. You can find links to some of the things we talked about on our website, ict-pulse.com. If you like this episode, please show your support by leaving us a review on iTunes, as it will help others find the show. You can email us at info@ict-pulse.com or drop us a note on our Facebook page, facebook.com/ICTPulse, or via Twitter @ICTPulse. We hope you'll join us again for our next episode. Take care.